Welcome everyone. This one is called Decoding Egoism. Now, we are covering the views of Thomas Hobbes, but we're doing it in a special way. We're doing it in the context of the last couple of lessons, essentially in the context of the ideas of Immanuel Kant, whom we covered in the very last video. So if you haven't watched those, you should probably check those out first. Unless you like things out of context, and that's cool, go ahead and check out this one on Thomas Hobbes. Now, speaking of context, Thomas Hobbes's worldview is a little gloomy, and we can understand this because, well, in his recent memory, there were several big, gigantic catastrophes, and they sort of, are all over the place. Some of them are societal, medical emergencies. Others are more intellectual. There's also religious conflict. So it's definitely the case that Thomas Hobbes was influenced by, his early life. And his early life, well, sometimes that time period is called the crisis of the Enlightenment. So it really is well recognized to be a tumultuous time period with socio-political instability, and there's also this. I think all of us now are familiar with pandemics. In London, there was a plague outbreak in 1592 through 93, and this is just sort of the recurring Black Death that would every once in a while come back and rage in some European city. The Black Death first struck Europe in the 1200s, and after that time period, essentially for centuries, they had to just live with the recurring little flare-ups of this plague. So that was in Thomas Hobbes's memory. There's also the various religious conflicts that were breaking out after the Reformation. For those who don't know, the Reformation began in the, let's just say, 1520s. And soon after that, there was quite a bit of conflict between those that came to be known as Protestants and Catholics. The 30 Years' War is one example of that. It began in 1618. And, well, it is 30 years long, so it ends in 1648, right around the time that Thomas Hobbes is writing his master work, the Leviathan, which is the work that we'll be looking at. All right, so there's religion, there's, medical concerns that, keep cropping up. There's also the intellectual concerns that were preoccupying various thinkers at the time. So, of course, the geocentric model was getting thrown out, and this is a time period when Galileo was, being confined to house arrest for the rest of his life. The authorities, the Pope, wanted more than house arrest for Galileo. They wanted to put him to death. Luckily, he got away just with spending the rest of his life in his quarters. So these were the things that were preoccupying various thinkers, and they recognized that they needed a new foundation for their sciences and for their philosophies and maybe even for their religious views, right? And so for these reasons, we recognize this as a very unstable time period, and it must have been very mentally taxing for many people. In fact, we get the resurgence of very old views having to do with acquiring peace of mind. So ataraxia is an ideal state of mind where one achieves a complete suspense of belief, and which ancient schools of philosophy taught would help one achieve serene calmness. So it was so psychologically oppressive, this time period, that some intellectuals literally dug back in history to find some technique, some kind of trick to be able to cope with it all. And one way is to just suspend your beliefs. You know what? I'm not going to believe anything. I'm not going to be sure about anything, and that's how I'm going to get a little bit peace of mind. You turn inwards. You say, well, I don't know what's going out in the world, and I don't need to understand it. I don't want to think about it. So this is one take on what the Pyrrhonian skeptics and the Stoics used to do. It's kind of an unflattering take, but definitely some thinkers kind of feel that way about these philosophical movements. And you can sort of feel the psychological angst, shall we say, that some thinkers were feeling at the time. Here is Michel de Montaigne, and here's a nice little quote from him that shows you, oh man, they were going through something, right? What goodness is that which but yesterday I saw in credit and esteem, and tomorrow to have lost all reputation, and that the crossing of a river is made a crime? What truth is that which these mountains bound, and is a lie in the world beyond them? So there it is, a lot. Everything was in pieces. There was no coherence, right? Some things were true here but false over there, and some things are useful and good and in good esteem here but not over there. It just seems like new foundations needed to be sought out. Now, if this all sounds familiar, because you're in this course, well, that's exactly what René Descartes was looking to do. He was looking for a new foothold, a new foundation for the sciences and philosophy and religious belief and all these things. He was one person who was trying to address the crisis of the Enlightenment. Well, we've been looking at his views, and that is one way, one proposed solution. Now let's look at Thomas Hobbes. As I said earlier, he publishes Leviathan in 1651, and this is going to be an entirely different route than what we've seen with Descartes and with Kant. This is going to be decidedly deflationary. That's probably the right word for it. So let's begin with Hobbes' ethics, and let's see what you think. Here are basically the starting points, the most important theses for Thomas Hobbes. There just is no objective right and wrong, right? So you might have this idea of an objective morality, but Hobbes might say, well, you just got that idea from religion, which of course he rejects. He does not believe that religion is a useful guide towards the truth. So if there is no objective right and wrong, all that there really is right for you and right for me and that kind of stuff. This is called moral subjectivism. There is no right in general, just what you think is right, and what I think is right, and what she thinks is right, etc., right? So this is basically the polar opposite of what Immanuel Kant was arguing in the last video. All right, that's just the first thing, right? So he basically thinks right and wrong are like beauty. Many people today think that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You think it's beautiful, I don't think so, and that's okay. You have your opinion, I have mine. That's sort of what Hobbes thinks about morality. Well, speaking of goodness, good just is pleasure, right? Whenever you want to talk about goodness, you're not talking about a command from God, because of course Hobbes rejects that. If you want to know what good is, the buck stops at basically pleasure. If you want to, so to speak, promote goodness, what you want to do is promote human pleasure, or just the mental state of experiencing pleasure. That just is what good means. And in that context, here's what bad means. Bad is pain. So pain is bad, pleasure is good. And that just is the definition of goodness and badness, respectively. So that is another guiding piece of guiding assumption for Thomas Hobbes. And here's one more. Acting in one's self-interest is both natural and rational. This view usually goes by the title of psychological egoism. There's other names for it. Today we call it rational choice theory as well. So here is the basic gist of it. Now, this idea is not original to Thomas Hobbes. In fact, You can go find this view all the way back in Plato, 2,400 years ago. So not original to Hobbes, but Hobbes definitely defended it in a fairly robust way. He just says, hey, it's difficult to see how we need to explain anything other than with self-interest. You might think to yourself that you do some good deeds because you want to help other people. But really, whenever you do a good deed, it just feels so good, or maybe you want to receive the benefits of, having a reputation for being a cooperative person. Everything you do, including your good deeds, Hobbes would say, you do them out of self-interest, because it really does pay off, I don't know if you've noticed, to do good deeds sometimes, in particular if people are watching. You get a reputation, oh, that one's honest, you should trust him. And then that pays dividends, social dividends down the line. And so these are some of Hobbes's starting assumptions, and he argues for them. I won't give you the arguments for them now, but these are what are going to shape his ethical worldview. Now, he argues that we all have a right to defend ourselves, but people need to make their own decisions about when it is appropriate to defend themselves. So, of course, it seemed utterly rational to Hobbes and other thinkers at the time that, if anything, you have a right, even a duty, to protect your own life. But you got to make the calls, Someone can't be watching out for you and telling you, oh, now it's time. This is sort of an individual decision. But human psychology being what it is, full of biases, we're likely to overreact and overreach sometimes. And this introduces instability into our relations with others. I actually have a great example of this. I literally had a neighbor who got into a fight with another neighbor because he thought that this neighbor stole some of his packages from, I don't know, Amazon or whatever. And so this kind of thing happens. Now, it probably wasn't the neighbor that did it, but the mere suspicion, that the fact that they had a pre-existing beef with each other, it made the one neighbor with his confirmation bias say to himself, oh, it must have been him. And before you know it, they came to fisticuffs, right? And that's no way to solve your problems, first of all, my friends. But secondly, that is totally expected given our human psychology. We make mistakes. We're not omniscient. And if you are in a state of a panic or sort of whenever you get something stolen from you, you're a little bit more guarded and paranoid. And if that's where you are, psychologically speaking, well, then people start to look like enemies. And before you know it, well, these inaccuracies, I should say, compound. And we eventually devolve into a state of war. Now, that's what happened, so to speak, with my neighbors. They got into a fight, not quite a war, right, but into a fight. And just imagine this compounding across all of society, where it might end up in a war of all against all. So Hobbes says, all you have to do, he doesn't say this directly, but all you have to do is imagine, maybe a natural disaster or a zombie apocalypse or whatever, right? When society isn't functioning on all cylinders and no one's out to protect you, right? There are no authorities who are making sure that your stuff and your life is protected. We're all going to go after each other. We're all going to do whatever we need to do to survive, including lying, cheating, stealing, and killing. And so this is what our natural condition is. Hobbes calls this the state of nature. When no one is making sure we're not harming each other, we go into a melee. We get into a situation where we're all against each other. Well, what do? The solution is to give all the power to a central authority who would decide on moral and legal matters to everyone's benefit. This will stabilize society and be to everyone's benefit. So the basic idea is you want to give all the power to a king or a council, small number of people, or maybe just one person. and they will just say, okay, here's the law that we're going to follow. Now they will ideally design the law in sort of an optimal way that is stable and won't cause more problems. But it's not that it's the right one. It's one that just works and is imposed on people from above. That way, if someone says, well, I don't really like it, well, it doesn't really matter what you like. This is the law we're going to follow. And if anyone breaks it, we're going to make sure to punish them. The basic idea here is that rather than having each other, like we currently do in society, fight over which laws are going to get put into effect or what's right, what's wrong, we'll just have a king or queen decide what those things are, impose it on us, and we all just, stay in our lane. That's Hobbes' solution. Now, Hobbes sometimes gets lampooned a little bit about his politics. They'll say, oh, Hobbes, he would have loved Stalin, or here on the right is Pinochet, who was a Chilean dictator for several decades. I think that's actually slightly uncharitable to Thomas Hobbes. Now, it's not to say that his politics are not reprehensible in some sense, but here's sort of maybe a better example of the kind of authoritarianism that Hobbes was okay with. So Russia's Catherine the Great, those are the time periods when she was around, she's sometimes called an enlightened despot. Now, what does that mean? Well, she had, maybe not complete authority, not total authority. That sort of totalitarianism wasn't possible yet. But she did have a whole lot of power. And she basically modernized Russia from above, right? She just said, well, here's what we're going to do now, and here's what you're going to build now. And some of it, actually all of it, was fueled by, feudalism, serf labor, and that kind of stuff. So it was brutal, but in a way, she raised the tide, right? And the rising tide lifted all the boats. Russia was modernized and was recognized to be one of the great European nations. And that was the whole, that was the goal. So she was a despot. She did this with kind of a tyrannical, approach, right? She did it with, it involved human suffering, but it also improved the lot of many in Russia. Actually, most, you could say most citizens benefited from this in some maybe tiny way, at least. Russia's Catherine the Great is a pretty good example of how you can impose reforms from above, and they do, on average, improve the life of the regular citizen. Another example might be Prussia's Frederick the Great. Those are the dates when he was around. There he is playing a flute or whatever. And another enlightened despot. And what did Frederick the Great do? Well, he was pen pals and friends with a bunch of enlighteners. But one of the things that he's most well known for is he banned torture. And he also tried to scale back or civilize public executions. Now, if you don't know about this time period, public executions were a thing. And they were pretty brutal. And so Frederick the Great was trying to get rid of these things so that humans would, his citizens would not involve themselves in such depravity, right? And so again, this is, it's not like anyone voted on this in Prussia and modern day Germany. Frederick just took it away from them. He just took public execution away from them, or he tried to make it more humane. And so, it's not a bottom-up kind of thing. It's not democratic. It's imposed from above. And Hobbes, I think, would like that sort of thing, right? He wasn't around for Frederick the Great or Catherine, but that's sort of the ruler that Hobbes was, likely to endorse. Okay, let's switch gears here. That, in a nutshell, are the views of Thomas Hobbes. Now, are they true? Well, at least with regards to this course, we're going to focus on just one aspect of his views in general. Obviously, if you want to analyze Hobbes's view as a whole, well, you have to look at all sorts of things: sociology, political science, history, very likely, even anthropology. Probably he makes some claims that are addressed the best by a field like anthropology. In this case, though, we're going to look at psychological egoism because it pertains very closely to this idea of free will that we've been talking about. Now, Hobbes was not a libertarian about free will. He was a compatibilist. He basically says your actions are free as long as no one impedes you from doing them, right? So as long as you wanted to do it, then that action is free. That's a perfect compatibilist right there. And that compatibilism is compatible, or it grows out of his psychological egoism. Everything that you do is rooted in self-interest. And so you're literally only free to do those things that, are self-interested, right? So obviously he doesn't have any views that are very libertarian in many ways, right? Even politically too. So let's focus on this psychological egoism bit. Obviously, it seems that Hobbes' views rely on the truth of psychological egoism. That's one of his guiding, starting assumptions. And, a lot of people are convinced by the philosophical arguments themselves. They just say, well, it does look like people, usually behave out of self-interest. Or it does look like, even the good things that we do are actually based off self-interest. Well, this is not new, but I'm going to just cite this particular group of philosophers. According to Stitch and colleagues, the question of psychological egoism is simply the question of whether altruism, acting for the benefit of others, exists or not. Let me pause right there. Basically, if you want to know if psychological egoism is true, all you have to do is show that it is possible to behave for the benefit of others. That's called altruism. And if you can show that, humans are capable of that, even once in a while, even if it's rare, it doesn't matter. Because Hobbes' view is that all behavior is rooted in self-interest. So if you can even find one counterexample, boom, that's enough to defeat psychological egoism in this strong form. Well, this question of whether we are capable of altruism or not, that is ultimately an empirical question, a matter to be resolved on the basis of scientific evidence. So that's basically a question that we have to send over to the social psychologists. They're probably the subfield of psychology that is most suited for that question. But I know that some other disciplines get involved with this too. So I know some sociologists are concerned with this question. In any case, this is actually not a philosophical view. It is a view about human psychology, and as such, we can't settle this by just talking about it here in a philosophy class. It has to be done on the basis of rigorous scientific evidence, right? So ultimately an empirical question. Okay, well, that doesn't leave us in a good place. It basically leaves us with, a dilemma. We're on the horns of a dilemma. So which was true? Is it Kant's worldview with an objective morality and libertarian free will, right? Is that the right sort of cluster of views that we should endorse? Or here is an entirely different alternative. It is very deflationary. Where Kant says that morality is objective, Hobbes says, you know what? Morality is just a convenient fiction. It's this little quirk of our psychology. We think that because I say, hey, that's right, and you say, hey, that's wrong, there's such a thing as rightness and wrongness. But it's just an idea that we came up with, and it doesn't really pertain to anything objective. Well, that's Hobbes' view on morality. And there's also the issue of, psychological egoism, which is highly compatible with compatibilism. So now we are in quite a bind here. The ideas that we've been looking at for the last couple of lessons are all clashing here. Should we be libertarians and believe in an objective morality? Or is compatibilism the right way to think about free will? And does that mean that morality is subjectivist, right? Or constructed, socially constructed in some way? It's not obvious that we can arrive at answers to these simply by intuition. You can't just, here's what you should definitely not do. You should definitely not say, well, I like libertarian free will and an objective morality, so Kant is right. You need a good reason to choose Kant over Hobbes. And we will continue to look at this problem in subsequent videos. For now, though, we are, as usual, still stuck in the pit of skepticism. There just is no definitive way out of this bind yet, although we will continue to work on it, and hopefully soon we'll get some real answers.